In the last chapter, we studied ICT liquidity. We learned to mark obvious highs, obvious lows, internal liquidity, and external liquidity. But after price reaches liquidity, the next question is movement. Does price drift away slowly, or does price leave with force? When price moves away with force, it can leave an imbalance behind. One common way to describe that imbalance is a fair value gap. A fair value gap, or FVG, is an area created when price moves quickly through a zone. The move is so one-sided that part of the path is not traded through in a balanced way. In simple terms, it is an imbalance. Price moved fast. The candles did not overlap normally. That leaves an area on the chart that traders may watch later. The key word is may. The common teaching model uses 3 candles. Look at candle 1, then look at candle 2, the strong displacement candle, then look at candle 3. In a bullish fair value gap, the high of candle 1 does not overlap the low of candle 3. In a bearish fair value gap, the low of candle 1 does not overlap the high of candle 3. The open space between them is the gap. Displacement is the force behind the fair value gap. A small candle can leave a small gap, but the better educational example is a strong candle with clear intent. The candle moves away from an area with speed. It may break structure. It may leave other candles behind. It may show that one side took control for that moment. Without displacement, the gap is less meaningful. A bullish fair value gap forms during a strong move upward. The first candle has a high. The second candle pushes up with displacement. The third candle has a low that stays above the first candle high. The space between the first candle high and the third candle low is the bullish gap. Traders may watch that area if price pulls back later. A bearish fair value gap forms during a strong move downward. The first candle has a low. The second candle pushes down with displacement. The third candle has a high that stays below the first candle low. The space between the first candle low and the third candle high is the bearish gap. Traders may watch that area if price retraces later. The gap matters because it represents imbalance. Balanced price action overlaps more naturally. Buyers and sellers interact through the area. An imbalanced move is different. Price moves quickly and leaves a thin area behind. The fair value gap is a visual way to mark that thin area. It helps you see where movement was inefficient. You may hear the word mitigation. Mitigation means price returns to the fair value gap and trades back into the imbalance. Sometimes it touches the gap and reacts. Sometimes it fills part of the gap. Sometimes it fills the entire gap. Sometimes it ignores the gap completely. The return to the gap is not the whole idea. The response matters. A fair value gap is not magic. It is not an automatic entry. It is not guaranteed to fill. It is not important just because you can draw a rectangle around it. The value comes from context. Where did the gap form? What happened before it? What happens when price returns to it? Liquidity gives fair value gaps better context. Price may first take buy-side liquidity above a high. Then it may reject and displace lower, leaving a bearish fair value gap. Price may first take sell-side liquidity below a low. Then it may reject and displace higher, leaving a bullish fair value gap. The liquidity event helps explain why the displacement may matter. Market structure also matters. A fair value gap that forms after a meaningful structure break has more context than a random gap in the middle of noise. If price breaks a higher low and leaves a bearish gap, that can support a bearish shift. If price breaks a lower high and leaves a bearish gap, that can support a bullish shift. Structure keeps the gap connected to the larger story. Supply and demand can also frame the gap. A bearish fair value gap may form as price leaves supply with strength. A bullish fair value gap may form as price leaves demand with strength. The area that caused the move and the gap created by the move can work together. But the gap is still only part of the read. You still need response, structure, and context. In a trend, fair value gaps often appear during strong continuation legs. An uptrend may displace upward and leave a bullish gap. Later, price may pull back toward that gap before continuing. A downtrend may displace downward and leave a bearish gap. Later, price may retrace toward that gap before continuing. The gap is useful only if the larger trend context still supports it. In a range, fair value gaps need extra caution. Price can move quickly inside the range and still remain trapped between the range high and range low. A gap inside a range may fill quickly. A gap after a clean range break may matter more. The difference is acceptance. Does price stay outside the range, or does it fall back into the same rotation? Not every gap is equally useful. A clean fair value gap is usually connected to strong displacement. The candles are clear. The imbalance is easy to see. A messy gap may sit inside choppy candles with weak structure. If you have to force the drawing, the gap may not be worth attention. Clear examples teach better than cluttered examples. Price does not have to fill every gap the same way. Sometimes price taps the edge of the fair value gap and reacts. Sometimes it trades to the middle. Sometimes it fills the entire area. Sometimes it trades through the gap and invalidates the idea. That is why beginners should avoid rigid rules. The response at the gap is more important than the exact percentage. Charts can show multiple fair value gaps. If you mark all of them, the chart becomes crowded. Start with the gaps connected to the clearest displacement. Then ask which gap aligns with structure, liquidity, supply and demand, or trend context. The most useful gap is usually not the smallest rectangle you can find. It is the gap with the cleanest reason to matter. When price returns to a fair value gap, watch candle behavior. Does price reject the area? Does it close away from the gap? Does it create follow-through? Or does price accept through the gap with no reaction? The candle response helps separate a useful area from a rectangle that price ignores. Again, response matters. A beginner workflow can stay simple. First, look for liquidity being taken or structure being broken. Second, look for displacement away from that area. Third, mark the fair value gap created by the displacement. Fourth, check context, trend, range, supply, demand, and structure. Fifth, if price returns, watch the response. That process prevents the gap from becoming a random drawing. The first mistake is marking every tiny gap. The second mistake is ignoring whether displacement created the gap. The third mistake is using a fair value gap without liquidity or structure context. The fourth mistake is assuming every gap must fill. The fifth mistake is treating the rectangle as more important than price response. Fair value gaps are useful only when they simplify the read. Here's the recap. A fair value gap is an imbalance left by fast price movement. The common model uses 3 candles. Displacement makes the gap more meaningful. A gap may be revisited, partially filled, fully filled, or ignored. Liquidity, structure, supply and demand, and trend context all matter. The response at the gap is the key. This completes the first foundation sequence. You now have language for market structure, trends, ranges, support, resistance, supply, demand, candles, break and retest, liquidity, reversals, and fair value gaps. That does not mean every chart will be easy. It means you have a cleaner way to ask questions. Where is structure? Where is liquidity? Where is imbalance? And what is price doing in response?